We've got Congressman Darrell Issa on the line with us. He's from the 49th Congressional District of California. That is mostly San Diego, northern San Diego County and eastern San Diego County. He's here on the Moneywise program with us. Congressman Issa, thanks for joining us today.
You're hitting the nail right on the head, which is we're sort of fiddling here in Washington while Rome burns.
On what?
We're sort of fiddling here in Washington while Rome burns. They're talking about economic reform at a time in which, to be candid, it's the lack of ability to get private funding that should be addressed rather than government covering up for being part of the problem. Certainly you saw the volatility in the market today. No question at all, that's based on America's willingness to put $50 billion into the Greek market to make up for the bad behavior of Greece's public sector, rather than dealing with our mistakes in the public sector here.
That brings up a great point right there, which is the United States.
Sorry about that. That's a vote in the background.
No, that's that's all right. Well, that's San Diego for you. You bring up the point that the United States is going out to go try to help Greece. Now, I know that we're in a world community and the economy is now very global, and I get that. But the United States has also been amidst of a terrible recession, in a time where we've seen a lot of things going on with banks and securities and all these things the SEC's brought in. We're playing this huge blame game. But here we are still dumping $50 billion, I think, via the IMF, right?
Right, and one of the challenges there is we're dumping it on a nation whose actual debt is no greater than ours if you include the debt involved with the GSEs, Freddie and Fannie. You load those into our already accepted debt, not including Social Security, just including our actual debt, and our debt ratio is as high as Greece's, and going higher quicker.
Very quickly. Now, you're also, you sit on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Is that correct?
I do.
Okay. And one of the hot topics right now has been this idea of financial reform. What has been the hot button issue when it comes to the Democratic proposal for financial reform?
Well, the primary reform the Democrats want is they want to bring all forms of financial organizations into sort of the greater bank community. One of the bases for it is the law signed by President Clinton in his last days in office that undid so-called Glass-Steagall, which created real separation between banks and non-bank entities, and that was done away with in the last days of his administration. The amazing thing is they're not proposing that we simply bring Glass-Steagall back. Make a bank a bank. When you go to a bank and you do business with a bank, you know there's a set of rules, you know there's protections, you know that banks may fail, but your money is still safe. That's the nature of the FDIC. And oh, by the way, when you go to Goldman Sachs, from a trading standpoint, your stocks are safe, but bottom line is if you want to invest in them, you do so at your own peril. The amazing thing is we're trying to merge the two when the right thing to do is to say there are guaranteed institutions, they are limited, there are banks. Other than that, people have to be willing to realize that these other instruments are not too big to fail. If we do what the financial reform package does, whether there's a fund to pay off certain failures, what we're really doing is guaranteeing that the government will be there to pick up the pieces every single time there's a failure. And then when you look at the global meltdown, you realize that failure is why today there's no private money. All the money is basically government money, and it's borrowed government money, borrowed from Japan and China, exactly the wrong direction.
Okay, perfect. You started off the conversation perfectly. I want to talk about Glass-Steagall Act. Seems to me reinvention of the wheel is what's going on right now. We're going to have to do this when we come back from the break. It is 10:30. That's the live time here. Congressman Darrell Issa on the line with us. We are the Moneywise Guys. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We're the Moneywise Guys. Sherrod Wade is here. Carrie McGill. I'm Brian Wiley. On the line with us, Congressman Darrell Issa out of the 49th Congressional District of California. He's on the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform. Now we're talking about government reform. I think it's a good thing to do. Let's talk a little bit about this financial reform package, if we can. You talked about Glass-Steagall. It seems to me that the Democrats are trying to put together something that ultimately just puts it back into place anyway, but they just won't call it what it is.
Yeah, Well, the amazing thing is I'm perfectly happy to have the essence of Glass-Steagall, that if you're a bank, you have a special set of protections, including, clearly, that every depositor is guaranteed to receive their principal back up to whatever the limit is. That's all fine, because banks have an oversight, and when you look at bank failures, not the so-called bank bailouts, but real bank failures, they've been orderly throughout this entire process. But when you look at organizations like GMAC, General Motors has $50 billion worth of your money, and they got that money based on being a bank-like entity, not based on being a car manufacturer. The same thing happened with Chrysler. The same thing happened with Goldman Sachs. Actually, many of the banks that got the TARP money weren't even U.S. banks. It's very clear that if we're going to have reform by definition, the government should take on the minimum responsibility for the private sector that's necessary. Historically, that's been banks. That's not what's in the bill. That's not even close to what's in the bill. This is basically a takeover of anything that's considered too big to fail or financially relevant, and that's a step toward, I don't want to say socialism, but it's a step toward only the big survive and the little can't even prosper in that kind of environment.
You brought up the idea of TARP and this concern. You voted against TARP, right?
I voted against TARP. I led the charge against TARP, and I'm glad to say the vast majority of Republicans voted against TARP not once but twice. And I keep having to remind people that because they get this idea that just because President Bush was for it, that Republicans were for it. We weren't.
What's wrong with TARP and the way that it has been put into action, and then of course what would have been a good alternative to it?
Well, the amazing thing is, first of all, they never spent a penny in the way they said they were going to do, which was buying up toxic assets for a period of time. And we knew they wouldn't because they had the authority to do that using the Fed, which they've done. There's about $2 trillion on the Fed's book right now of these toxic assets. Not a penny was paid for them. They were done through the Fed, not through the TARP. What the TARP has turned into, which is what I think we predicted, is if you give a president, in this case two different presidents have had, the best part of $1 trillion worth of walking around money, they will use it like it was, simply an investment angel fund. And that's what they've done. They've picked and chosen all the places to use it, much of it to be voter specific. In other words, to suit a particular political agenda. And, the best proof of that is at General Motors. You understand that General Motors would never have suggested that cap and trade was a good idea or that the right of the EPA to regulate carbon was a good idea. But as soon as we, the taxpayers, own 65% of the company, suddenly they were all for it. And we've never been able to get an answer other than, government was controlling even a message that was counter to their best interest.
Excuse my ignorance on this one, but General Motors, all of that went on through the TARP program or the Bailout program?
Well, it went out. That's an interesting point. None of it was stimulus. It went out through two pots of money. Most of it was TARP. A little of it was this HARM and some of the other programs. But the $50 billion is basically TARP money. And that's how we own over 60% of the company today.
Would that also be the case with such as AIG or any of the big banks too?
AIG received over $180 billion, and the majority of it was also from TARP. And of course, some of that money that Goldman Sachs, the AIG got, came into the back door. About $6 billion of it back to AIG, which was not a loan, but almost a gift because it was money given to them that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten paid back from these credit default swaps. So there's a series of, and we've done a whole investigation at our committee, and if anyone goes to the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, the Republican side, there's detailed reports on some of the money trail. But the real problem is this. Government is growing, and government has no history, in recent history, of being a good place to put monetary control. And, part of it is the stimulus and TARP money, which has turned into big piggy banks for government to spend borrowed money. But part of it has also been this regulatory growth, justifying it because Freddie and Fannie inflated the home mortgage market by about $5.5 trillion, that somehow government should have more involvement. And what people keep forgetting is those are government-like entities created by government that ultimately were a big part of the problem, and yet what we're going to do is not only re-up them, but expand them.
Congressman Issa, you know, there's a growing feeling that us as the citizens, just the little guy, I mean, these numbers are so huge, these billions of dollars, now we're talking about trillions of dollars. There's this sense that we can't do anything, that it's just, this problem is so big that there's just no answer other than our vote. I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, there is no real answer other than your vote, and you've got to vote for people who are not looking to find Washington answers, but are willing to leave the answers in the state. In Sacramento, you've got to vote for people who are willing to, for the most part, leave those problems locally. You know, the end result of bigger and bigger and further away government is very predictable. If you create a bigger government in Washington, government will do more. But government will do more much further from the people. When I first came to Congress as a businessman, I said, well, maybe there's some solutions where government can play a positive role in it. I've learned very, very quickly that it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you cannot manage from this distance and do any good. So government, as Reagan would have said, government does best what it does least, and leave it at that. And
whereas he also said,
that's the important thing, is don't vote for anyone that's promising to go to Washington or go to Sacramento and do more. Vote for the people that are willing to go there and do only what is required, and leave the rest either to the local administrations or to the people, because that's the only way we're going to get back financial solvency in our country.
We got the 49th Congressional District Congressman Darrell Issa on the line with us. You had just mentioned, well, the TARP program, and showing that there's some delineation between that and obviously the bailout program. If the government were to become all of a sudden liable for all of the toxic assets that are inside a TARP, how much would that put taxpayers on the line for?
Well, the IG has estimated that the total obligation is over $14 trillion of various guarantees. Now, after discounting sort of the worst case of, you know, what your home is worth, even if it defaults, it ends up being like $5 trillion. But if you were to assume that everybody walked away from their home, that the markets really went bad, and that the government had to, quote, liquidate into the cash market, the government could lose an additional $5 trillion. And will they lose $5 trillion? If the economy returns, it'll be less. But I would not be surprised that when history is written, they will say, well, we only lost $500 billion. But of course, that will be excluding the cost of interest. And including the cost of interest on borrowed money, we probably will lose $1.5 to $2 trillion, which will then be there for your children and grandchildren to pay. And remember, we have $12 trillion and counting of actual debt on the books, not including the deficit that is about $1 trillion a year, and these couple of $1 trillion that we could lose over the next couple of years from these bailouts.
Meanwhile, we just started a brand new healthcare reform package that's going to cost us more money. I don't understand the timing, and I certainly do understand I guess the angst of the Tea Party example of just saying, listen, it's time for some new blood in there. How does that make you feel about your congressional seat?
Look, if I'm not willing to meet the requirements of the people of California and of my district, I would love to be thrown out, because I'd rather be on the outside watching somebody do a better job for our country than be on the inside not being responsive. And okay. I say that being somebody who, you know, had a private life and would not mind going back someday soon to the private life. But right now, I am welcoming the kinds of people, the Scott Browns and so on, that are coming in with a healthy, Rand Paul. These folks are coming in with a healthy disregard for what we do in Washington, coming in and saying, your answer has been bigger government and it's failed. The answer now has to be government in Washington doing what is constitutionally mandated and getting out of the No Child Left Behind, the expanding Medicare out of general tax revenue. Certainly, we want to make sure those who are truly destitute are taken care of. But, you know, the old expression, charity starts at home. The first charity should be among the family. The second charity should be among the community. The next charity, if those cannot, not if those will not, but if those cannot meet the needs, should go up the line. We do not have very many places in America where the city, the county, and the state cannot care their own. And that's part of our problem is there's this assumption that somehow Washington can do it better when nothing could be further from the truth.
It seems to be exactly the case, which it seems to me that Washington has kind of further messed up a lot of these things. Had we not had TARP or that program come in, we would have probably experienced massive bank failures or not. What's your opinion on that?
Not at all. The vast majority of banks not only were solvent, they did need to be assured that bank transfers would be backed by the government, and that could have been done with the Fed. Meaning that if a bank was transferring, FDIC, a regulated bank, was transferring $1 million or $10 million or $100 million between banks and between countries, we should have, as the U.S., said, we'll stand behind those transfers as valid and good. But that's where it should have ended. Underwriting and guaranteeing our banks around the world, our U.S. banks to other banks around the world, sure, we could have done that. But that's very different than underwriting insurance companies and various, on a selective basis, stock trading operations, finding ourselves backing derivatives that shouldn't even have been there. You know, derivative is a fancy name for either a bet or a hedge of a bet. And in many of these cases, those derivatives absolutely should be considered risky, and people should invest in them based on being willing to lose their money. And we're doing just the opposite. We're pretending that somehow we can make every investment safe. That's part of why those derivatives were in existence, is people said, well, everything's safe, so I'll take the highest yield. Well, the answer is not everything's safe, and you should take a conservative yield with your money. And quite frankly, you shouldn't buy a house you can't afford to make the payments on. And just the opposite was true. In California, we were buying homes based on the assumption that we would refinance them in 6 months or a year. That's a terrible way to invest in property.
Yeah, it's certainly not the money-wise way to do things, I can say that. Congressman Darrell Issa on the line with us. He's on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Last question for you before we got to let you go, which
Sure.
is since Social Security and Medicare are essentially, they cannot be cut. Do you plan, how would you plan to balance this budget, considering those fixed expenses?
Well, first of all, I think Social Security and Medicare can be cut. The idea that you can't cut in these programs is why they get away with murder. Medicare was expanded by $700 billion under the Bush administration, not including its growth. Those were new programs. Social Security has a promise that essentially says, we're going to allow this thing to grow even though the income coming in doesn't equal the outflow. Now, can you tell a senior who's dependent on Social Security that it's going to evaporate or not keep its promise? No. Can you limit it to what was originally promised? Yes. And can we begin means testing so that people in the future will understand that it's only there for them if they need it, not automatically there because, after all, it's a social welfare program? Yes. And that's got to be part of the cure. We can't simply say that we're going to raise the age from 67 to 68 to 69. That's a terrible way to manage, because some people at 65 simply no longer can work. So what we need to do is we need to modernize it, make real reforms, and change the expectation. So even those tough programs, if people are going to represent you in Washington, they've got to be willing to say everything's on the table, not necessarily for retirees, but certainly for my generation who are still working, who can still make plans and adjustments based on a new promise.
Congressman Issa, we've really enjoyed this. You're great. We appreciate you coming on the program here, and thanks for joining us
my
today.
pleasure. Have me back anytime.
Well, all right, we'll do that. We know who to contact, and we'll continue to ask you to come back on the program. Congressman Darrell Issa, again, 49th Congressional District of California, right here on the Moneywise program.